Hello, thank you for joining me today. We will not have a live class session. You can watch this recording, fill in your notes, and then you'll have time when you're finished to complete your 4.03 lesson assessment. This lesson is 4.03 Russia Rising. It goes along with your Human Odyssey book, reading pages 164 to 175. The first thing we're going to do is watch the flip video lesson. This was also assigned on Friday, so hopefully you have most of this done. If you are finished, please just watch. If you are not finished, you can go ahead and fill in the rest of your notes. It does go along with your student workbook pages 109 to 111. .03 Russia Rising. This goes along with your student workbook pages 109 to 111, your Human Odyssey reading pages 164 to 175. Lesson Introduction, Russia Rising. The title of this unit is New Powers in Asia, and this chapter is Russia Rising. But wait, isn't Moscow the Russian capital in Europe? Yes, it is, and so are 3/4 of the Russian people. But 3/4 of Russia's land is in Asia. Confusing but true. Russia, by far the biggest country in the world, extends from the Pacific Ocean to the Baltic Sea and covers some of the coldest regions on Earth. Its rich and varied history and culture include Viking traders, Byzantine religion and art, Mongol invaders, rulers named for Rome's Caesar, and centuries of isolation. Lesson objectives. Identify Russia as the largest country in the world, define Kremlin and explain Ivan's purpose in restoring the Kremlin in Moscow, describe the methods Ivan the Great used to conquer Russia and then unify and glorify it, describe the Mongol conquest of Russia, identify Ivan III as Ivan the Great and describe his accomplishments, identify Ivan IV as Ivan the Terrible and describe how he earned his nickname, identify Vladimir as the 10th century Grand Prince of Kiev who ordered Russians to convert to Orthodox Christianity, locate Russia on a map and identify its boundaries, land features, and cities. Matching. The Slavs were Eastern Europeans who first settled along a network of rivers in what later became Russia. Vikings were Scandinavians who traveled and settled along rivers in a region that eventually became Russia. Kiev was an important city. It became the capital of Russia. Boyars were landowning nobles of Russian cities. Vladimir was the Prince of Kiev who chose an official state religion, an Eastern Orthodox Church, the religion that began to thrive in Russia after 988. Invasion of Russia. Huge armies of Mongols invaded Russia in the 13th century. The invaders, who came to be called Tatars, were ruthless. They destroyed whole towns, killing entire populations. They leveled cities and looted treasures. The policy of terror caused Russians to view the Tatars as invincible. Ivan the Great, Ivan III. Ivan the Great, or Ivan III, gained territory and power within Russia in several ways. He bought his rivals' land. He persuaded and forced dying princes to leave their territories to him. He waged war. He deported troublemaking boyars. And he took millions of acres of land from boyars and gave it to men who served in his army and government. The end of Tatar rule in Russia. Ivan the Great stopped sending tribute to the Tatar court. In 1480, he announced he would no longer give his allegiance to the Tatar Empire. After a standoff between the Tatar army and Ivan's army, the Tatars retreated and left Russia to its native inhabitants. Russian Orthodox Church. The Russians gradually developed their own version of Christianity, calling it the Russian Orthodox Church. During the rule of the Tatars, there was limited communication between Russian Christians and Eastern Orthodox Christians in other regions. The isolated Russians adapted the religion. They conducted church services and read scripture in Russian. Ivan the Great, Tsar. Ivan the Great believed that Moscow had replaced Rome and Constantinople as the new center of Christianity. He married a Byzantine princess and even took a title from ancient Rome. He called himself Tsar, which comes from the Latin word Caesar, and that Tsar is pronounced with a Z, Tsar. Ivan III and the Kremlin. This is a who, what, when, where, why, how format for the next few slides. Who, Ivan the Great and Italian builders. What, Ivan built the Kremlin, where? Moscow. When? The late 15th and early 16th centuries. Why? It was old and crumbling. Ivan wanted a mighty fortress and a symbol of Russia's power. And how? European architects and engineers designed and built new walls, towers, and a moat. They also built a palace and 3 great stone cathedrals. Ivan the Terrible, also known as Ivan IV. Ivan the Terrible's early years as a young Tsar. Who? Ivan the Terrible, his mother, and powerful boyars. What? He was a mean young ruler, crowned Tsar of Russia at age 17. He promised to rule in the interest of the people, made little effort to look after Russia's peasant farmers. Where? Russia, Moscow. When? 1547, he was crowned Tsar. Life as a peasant in Russia. Who? Russian peasants. What? Peasants lived hard lives. They were poor. Landowners treated many of them as property. Many became serfs, legally bound to the land. Where? Russia. When? The 16th century. St. Basil's. Who? Ivan the Terrible, the Russian architect. What? Ivan ordered the construction of a cathedral and hired a Russian architect. It had a main church with a high tower and 8 small chapels with unique domes. Where? Moscow, Russia. When? The 16th century. Why? Ivan wanted to astonish people who saw the cathedral. And how? That's not really applicable for this question. End of Ivan IV's reign. Who? Ivan the Terrible, or Ivan IV. What? His behavior became more bizarre. He used secret police to terrorize his subjects. He killed his eldest son. He killed many of the boyar class. He died of a disease and left behind a vast empire. His reign of terror left Russia small in spirit and isolated from the West. Where? Russia. And when? The 16th century. It was 1584 when he died. And that comes to the end of this flip video lesson. Thank you for joining me today. Okay, so that was the flip video lesson. I'm not going to go through these objectives again because they were gone through on the lesson. But again, this is what we're going to cover for the rest of the recording, and then you will have time to complete your assessment on your own. So the origins in the Vikings and the Slavs. So Russia was this land of flat, wide open spaces. There were vast treeless plains, made up much of the country, and the open spaces allowed people from Eastern Europe, who were called Slavs, to settle along the network of great rivers crossing the land. And the Vikings were warlike mariners from Scandinavia who plundered much of Europe during the Middle Ages, and they sailed out on the frigid north to raid the Christian empire of Byzantium and steal its glittering treasures, kind of like when we talk about the Mongols. One group of Vikings, known as the Varangians, or Rus, reached Byzantium by traveling along a series of rivers that ran through the flat landscape. And as we've talked about before, Russia is a huge, vast, wide, open space of land. So Russia's size. Modern-day Russia takes up an enormous amount of land. It's the largest nation on Earth, and its territories lay in both Europe and in Asia. It's so big that it spans 11 or 12 time zones, and sometimes even more. The time zones sometimes vary and change. Over the past decade, the time zones have changed, so, again, that number varies a little bit, but a huge, wide area of land in Russia. And so during that time period, you can only imagine how many invasions there were and how much fighting there was, kind of depending on where you were in what part of that land area. So the Ural Mountains provided a natural border through history between Russia and the rest of Europe. And the Volga River flows out from the Ural Mountains and empties into the Caspian Sea. I'm sorry, that word border there, I have an R on the end. It should not, that's spelled incorrectly. But Russia had many other rivers, along with access to many coastlines. However, most of the rivers flow north into the Arctic Ocean, and most coastlines are on very cold bodies of water. So you can see all of those natural borders, those natural things that kind of kept invaders out. But those coastlines where invaders could come in, fortunately, they were on very cold bodies of water. So you can imagine that a lot of times those were ice covered or difficult to travel through. So Vladimir in the 10th century. So during the 10th century, Vladimir became the Grand Prince of Kiev. And in our modern world, Kiev is no longer part of Russia, but it is part of the Ukraine. At this time, the Russian region was made up of numerous city-states that were constantly at odds with each other. And we've talked about this before. During this time period, there was a lot of fighting, a lot of battling for territory, for land. Vladimir worked to unify these city-states under an alliance, and it wasn't entirely strong, but it was a start. He researched the common religions among the city-states and found the majority followed Orthodox Christianity. Thinking a single religion would help to bond his people better, Vladimir declared that all his subjects would be Orthodox Christians. And we've talked about this before as well. A lot of times during this time period, government and religion were the power. And so, with some areas we've talked about, some civilizations we've talked about have found it best to coexist with different religions, and some found it best to demand everyone follow one religion. And so this is going to lead into, future historical things that we are going to talk about. So the Mongol invasion in Russia. Just like the rest of Europe and Asia, the Russian region was not immune to Mongol Empire's conquest during the 13th century. And we talked about this in lesson 4.02 and how the Mongols had this huge effect on history. The Mongols, known as Tartars to the Russian people, launched particularly brutal attacks across Russia. Entire cities were destroyed, populations killed, and treasure taken. The Mongols, or Tartars, were so successful on the battlefield that many Russian survivors believed that the Mongols were invincible. And they just kind of came in and were very ruthless and very brutal and pretty much, took what they wanted. So they definitely did have a huge impact on history and where history would lead. So let's talk about Russia. Ivan the Third, which is during the 15th century. Ivan the Great was a prince of a Russian city-state during the Tartar rule. His city-state was powerful and wealthy thanks to its capital, Moscow, which was the center of trade. Ivan wanted more, though, so he put all his focus into being the leader of all of Russia. He first moved against the other Russian princes, gaining control through threats, bribes, or war, and he began building up his nation. Once under his control, some boyars, who were known as wealthy Russian nobles, spoke against him. And so Ivan quickly had them deported from his realm. Basically, they said, hey, we don't really agree with you. And so he said, okay, see you later. And he deported them. Eventually, Ivan was confident enough to make the move against the Tartars. He declared that he would no longer be sending them tribute, meaning sending them money or soldiers. He didn't feel that he needed to do that anymore, and that Russia was no longer allied to them. That word allied means that Russia was no longer friends with them. They were no longer on the same side. So as winter approached, the remaining Tartar forces decided to retreat from Russian lands without a single battle. Ivan the Great was now in firm control of his unified nation of Russia, which again was a really big deal because these Mongols were very notorious for coming in and taking over. Russia, more of Ivan III. As Ivan was now the leader of a large nation, he gave himself a new title, Tsar. And that can be spelled T-S-A-R or C-Z-A-R, but it's pronounced Tsar, like with a Z. It came from the Latin form of Caesar, like the Roman emperors, and was meant to evoke feelings of power and importance. Ivan would marry a Byzantine princess and declare Moscow as the capital of Christianity after Ottomans conquered Constantinople. And again, relay back what you learned a lesson or two ago about the Ottoman Empire, okay? And that map, if you remember seeing about Constantinople in our class slides. Ivan was also responsible for beginning to rebuild the Kremlin, one of modern-day Russia's most iconic structures. At first, the Kremlin was a defensive building, more like a fort. However, Ivan had a palace built within it, along with temples. The Kremlin began to symbolize Russia's power. So not only was it a great building, a great architectural building, it then became a defensive building, and then it was this symbol of power, kind of like our White House is today in America. So in Russia, Ivan IV during the 16th century. So Ivan IV was Ivan III's grandson, and he would be known as Ivan the Terrible. His father died when he was 3, and his mother during his teen years. Ivan IV was crowned Tsar when he was just 17. His rule was harsh and cruel. While he greatly expanded Russia's territory, he often tortured and killed those who disagreed with him. He strictly enforced serfdom, which is when peasants would basically be owned by the nobles on the land on whose land they were born. So if they were born on a certain noble's land, they basically belonged to that noble. These serfs had little hope to ever leave that land or to improve their standing. The lives of these serfs were usually unpleasant and short. Ivan the Terrible made sure that both his subjects and his enemies lived in fear of him. And it sounds like he read Machiavelli, if you remember from a few units ago. So that is the end of the lesson for today. So right now, I need for you to make sure that you have finished your reading pages 164 to 175 in your Human Odyssey book, which is right here. I also need to make sure that you have finished your student guide pages 109 to I believe it's 111 actually. This I think is a misprint. It should be 111. The pages that go along with your flip video lesson. And then you need to please make sure once you are finished with that, go back through the class notes if you need to, and then you can go ahead and take your 4.03 assessment. Okay? Thank you so much for joining me today in this video format, and I will be back in class tomorrow. And Mrs. Huffstetler's class is also watching this recording, so she will be back in class tomorrow as well. All right, thanks so much for joining us, guys. Have a great day.